Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve BERG. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Today's topic is a special one, although I think most topics we covered so far are special in their own way. Officially, I'm calling it timing, but more precisely, my guest and I are going to talk about how a better understanding of ourselves and our behavioral psychology can help to optimize how and when we do everyday things, and subsequently, how that optimization can give us the best chance possible to be successful at what we do. Author Daniel Pink is quoted as saying, "I used to believe that timing was everything. Now I believe that everything is timing." That quote is a little bit of a fake out because, as most of you know by now, I normally quote someone else before introducing my guest. However, today, Daniel Pink is my guest, and that is part of why this is a special episode. Daniel has authored a handful of books, which you probably already know, including the long-running New York Times bestsellers Drive and A Whole New Mind, which focuses on work, management, and behavioral science. He was host and co-executive producer of the 2014-2015 National Geographic Channel social science TV series Crowd Control, and his latest book, out on January 9th, is called When: The Scientific Secret of Perfect Timing. And that is what he and I will be talking about today. Hi, Daniel. As you know, I've wanted to talk to you for quite a while, so it's a real pleasure. First of all, did I leave anything out of your bio?
No, that was very comprehensive, Steve. I appreciate it.
A little bit of research goes a long way.
Yeah.
So the new book, When, fits right into the podcast theme about success drivers. And there's a lot in I want to cover, so I'm going to just jump in straight away here. To me, this book is about understanding our behavioral psychology and our biology so that we can do three things. One, better map what we want to accomplish to our day. Two, adopt behaviors and maximize our abilities. And three, understand bigger picture patterns. All with the idea that we can increase the odds of success. Do I have that mostly right?
Absolutely, you have that mostly right. That's what it is. So what I'm trying to do is use some what I felt was science that hadn't been adequately tapped to help us do all three of the things that you mentioned, to help us, on a day-to-day level at our work and our lives, to also help us achieve a sense of well-being, but also, as you say, understand these broad patterns that are going on in our lives, even though they're often invisible to us.
And so I think one of the things you probably found out is that there's actually a lot of science behind it. And there's probably 15, 20 different studies that you quote in the book. So I think there's a lot of research done.
15, 20. Oh, no, I quote more than 15, 20. They're like 26 pages of endnotes. So yeah, no, there's a huge amount of research out there. And that's one of the daunting things about this book is that there was so much research out there. It took me a really long time to track through, figure out, and try to make sense of. But what this research tells us, the most important thing is that this research, which is across several domains, not only behavioral sciences like social psychology, economics, anthropology, but even biological sciences, even things like endocrinology, anesthesiology, what it tells us is that two things, I think. One is that these questions of timing, these questions of when we do things, have a material effect on our lives. And two, that if you understand this research, you can begin to make systematically better, smarter, more evidence-based decisions in your life.
Right. On the last page of the book, you talk about what you learned in researching it. And, while I didn't get to the last page until the last page, I think that I think that is a really interesting summary. And so I don't want to walk through that with you right now.
Okay, sounds good.
You say that you used to believe in ignoring the waves of the day, but now you believe in surfing them. By waves, I assume you're referring to the temporal effect pattern and the circadian rhythm?
Right. To these broad hidden pattern of the day that it's driven in part by circadian rhythm, driven in part by other forces. I mean, what the research shows pretty clearly is that there are three core stages of our day: a peak, a trough, a rebound. For most of us, we proceed through the day in that order, in the, peak, trough, rebound. For people, the 1 in 5 of us who are night owls, it's usually the reverse order. But what it shows is that if we use some of this evidence, we can make slight alterations in our work schedule to do better. And what it shows more specifically is the following: that during our peak, that's when we're better at doing analytic tasks that require heads down, focus, and vigilance. We can bat away distractions very well. So think about something like writing a legal brief. That would be good work for the peak. During the trough, which usually occurs in the early to mid-afternoon, that's not good for very much. We're better off doing our administrative work. And then during the rebound, we're actually better off doing more kind of creative work because we have this less vigilance than we have during the peak, but also a better mood than during the trough, and that can allow us to come up with more aha moments, more breakthrough kind of thinking. And I think the most important thing here is that that time of day explains about 20% of the variance in human performance on these kinds of workplace tasks. That's a big deal. It doesn't mean that timing is everything, but it means it's a big thing. And if we are just more intentional, more systematic about when we do certain kinds of work, we're going to do the work better.
So you mentioned the notion of like night owls and more, or night people and morning people. I think are there other patterns or other pattern orders that are different for different people as well?
Well, the truth is that everybody has their unique, what's called a chronotype. And if you look at the distribution, so just to take a step back, so these morning people, often referred to as larks, they end up rising early, falling asleep early. The evening people, often referred to as owls, rise later in the day, fall asleep later. And each of us has our own distinct pattern. It actually changes over our lifetimes. There's a peak of owliness between about the ages of 14 and 24. But the gist of it is that, some portion of us, call it 1 in 6 or so, are pretty strong larks. Some portion of us, call it 1 in 5, are very strong owls. Most of us are kind of in the middle. But so we each have our unique, our unique pattern. But it's shaped not quite like a bell curve, but almost like a bell curve, where you have some relatively few strong larks and strong owls, and a lot of people in the middle.
Right. So the notion of surfing them, you talked a little bit about the timing for analytics problems versus insight problems.
Right.
In particular, I hang with an entrepreneurial crowd as a venture capitalist. There's something called the inspiration paradox. A little comment on that I think might be helpful for that group of people.
Yeah. That has to do with this recovery period. So during a peak, we are exceptionally vigilant. Vigilance is the key idea here. We can bat away distractions. We are locked in. It's harder to distract us, which means that when we're doing this kind of focus work that requires deep concentration, we do a better job of it. And so we're better off putting that kind of work in that kind of period. And in some cases, we think of that as the optimal period. And for most people, that's the mornings. For me, it's the mornings as well. So then we think about the late afternoon and early evening. That is not the optimal period for doing that heads down focused work. It's non-optimal for that. But the paradox comes in, the inspiration paradox comes in, and that period, which is non-optimal for those heads down tasks, is actually great for things that require the sort of entrepreneurial thinking that you're talking about, for brainstorming, for iterating a new idea for a product or a service, for coming up with a non-obvious solution. And the reason is, and I ticked at this a little bit before, is that we're actually less vigilant. And when you're doing brainstorming, when you're doing creative kinds of work, you don't want to be super, super vigilant. You want to actually let in a few distractions because it's going to allow you to see things with fresh eyes. And so that combination of letting in a few distractions, coupled with the enhanced mood that comes to the end of the day, because our pattern of mood follows that peak trough recovery pattern, the combination of enhanced mood and the fact that some of the inhibitions disappear makes it very powerful for the sort of entrepreneurial creative work that you're describing. And so the inspiration paradox is that this time that is non-optimal for heads down work is actually optimal for this more creative kind of work.
So I guess I should, what you're saying is I should not be shocked that most of my entrepreneurs don't get into the office until noon.
Well, that could be that you have owls as entrepreneurs. That's what that sounds like to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that's totally cool. I mean, one of the things that you have to understand is that, and I think entrepreneurial companies are better at this, is that not all times of the day are created equal. And what you have to do is you have to look for some synchrony between someone's chronotype, between the kind of work they're doing and the time of day. And if you just simply say, everybody has to do the same sorts of things at the same time of the day, you're leaving capacity on the table. And back to your entrepreneurial owls. I mean, the modern workplace in general is really biased against owls. And so you have these people who have these later chronotypes, particularly younger people, especially people in their early 20s, coming in for an 8 a.m. meeting is torture. They shouldn't be doing that.
Right. So what you're saying is that if we talk about surfing these waves, the synchrony effect is really when we line up what we can do with the optimal time to do it.
Exactly.
Okay. So moving down the list of the things that you learned, you mentioned that you used to believe that lunch, naps, and taking walks were niceties, but now you believe they're necessities.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're describing ways to minimize the negative impacts to productivity, that tend to happen in the troughs of our temporal affective pattern. On the other hand, I was having dinner with a couple of folks last night, and they said, well, it's lovely that you have the time and energy and people to answer your emails while you're doing these things. Nobody has the time to do that. So I disagreed with them, but I think the way that you make the argument is that you walk through them and explain the value of them. So let's talk about the power of the restorative break. And I think you gave 5 guiding principles for that.
Yeah. So what the research shows pretty clearly is that breaks matter a lot more than we realize. And to me, it's analogous. And I think the comments of your dinner partners are helpful here. It's analogous to sleep. A few years ago, people who and you saw this in the entrepreneurial world. People would say, "Oh, I pulled an all-nighter, my second all-nighter in a row. I only get by on 4 hours of sleep." And 15 years ago or so, we thought those people were heroes. Now we realize they're fools, and that's largely because the science of sleep has emerged. We realize that people who are sleep deprived are actually operating in a diminished capacity. Their performance is lower, and their bad performance is actually cascading and affecting other people's performance. And so I think that breaks are where we were on sleep 10 or 15 years ago, that we have to start thinking of breaks not as a deviation from performance, but as part of performance. And that breaks are integral to our productivity and our creativity. That breaks are not a deviation from being a professional. They are part of what it is to be a professional. And so if it's sort of like, I'm not sure that one should sacrifice an hour and a half of sleep at night to answer email. I'm not sure that's a good use of limited resources. And I think the same thing is true with breaks. It doesn't mean that you go back to, an old-fashioned Latin American siesta where you leave the office from 1 o'clock and return at 4 o'clock. But what it does mean is that we should be much more intentional about breaks. We should schedule them, even if they're only 5 or 10 minutes long. And as you say, Steve, we know a lot about what kind of breaks are most restorative. We know that breaks that are fully detached are better than those that are semi-detached. So don't bring your phone with you. That's not really a break. We know that social breaks are better than solo breaks, even for introverts. We know that the importance of movement. So to the extent you can take a walk for 5 minutes during your break, that's better. Being in nature surprisingly has an effect on how restorative a break is. And so, what we really need to do is respect this science and understand that breaks are not, that in some level, breaks are more important than answering ridiculous email that might be irrelevant in 6 or 7 hours.
I've seen, just as a external case in point, there's a new school in our neighborhood that basically is taking this to heart. And what they've done is they've shortened the time of the classes, and you switch after only a couple of minutes. And that's because they found that, one, that gives a chance for a break and a restart, and two, that the starts are where people are the most productive and most thoughtful. So
interesting. Yeah.
And and some of the particularly the kids with ADD or whatever tend to be thriving in this. So clearly,
very interesting.
Clearly, the research is moving forward. All right, we're going to move on to lunch. Right, I'm a lunch guy. There's value in actually taking a break and going to lunch.
Yeah. Again, it doesn't mean that you take a 2-hour martini-soaked lunch every day, but there is a lot to be said, and the research is pretty clear on this. A lot of it. What's interesting is that a lot of the research on lunch in particular, and some of this break research, comes out of these very intense business cultures like South Korea, where breaks and it's even more intense than, say, the East Coast of the United States or Silicon Valley. And what they're showing is that, a half-hour break where you detach for lunch, perhaps with other people, not talking about work, actually boosts your overall productivity. Now, what we have to do when we think about our output, whether it's like what we accomplish or what creative ideas we have, is that we have to take the long view, and even the long view at the level of a day. It's true that if you leave for half an hour, you're not going to be able to answer email during that half hour. However, the odds are also greater that at the end of the day, you'll have gotten more done, even if you had to sacrifice answering email during that period. And again, what this research shows, on all this kind of stuff, is that one doesn't have to take the extreme version of it where you're taking massively long breaks all the time. But my advice to people based on this research is what they should do is they should schedule every afternoon 2 breaks. What's interesting is that all these people who don't do breaks end up going to meetings that are scheduled only because they're scheduled. And these meetings, as most people in offices know, many meetings are kind of a waste of time. So schedule 2 15-minute breaks every afternoon, and you're going to get more done. Even if, I know it's terrifying for people, even if during that 15 minutes you can't look at your email.
Well, my experience suggests as much as well. The other thing that I was going to say about lunch is that part of your capacity for decision making and willpower resides in your kind of physiological levels. And so when you take lunch, you're kind of refilling your gas tank, your capacity for correct decision making. But I remember particularly the instance about not wanting to be the last person that a judge sees before he goes for his break.
Right.
Because you're much more likely to not get parole.
Which ought to terrify us, again, because if you just through the sake of random scheduling are up for parole, you're the person right before a judge takes her break, and I'm the person right after a judge takes her break. I'm more likely to get parole than you for nothing to do with the facts of the case. All has to do with the time of day, and I find that a little terrifying.
Well, but it's instructive that it's real.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I mean, it's instructive that it's necessity. It's not just like, well, it might be right. It's right.
Yeah.
So I know you've touched on naps, but I just have to get this quote in, so I'm going to bring it up again.
Okay.
In the book, there's the quote, "Naps are the Zambonis for our brains." Mm-hmm. And so, but maybe we can talk about, in particular relation to this, the impact of naps on our capacity to learn and also memory, because those are pretty key.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of research about just sleep in general as essential for learning and memory, well beyond naps. This research is powerful. I even say it to my own kids. I have 2 college students and a high school student. So, like for my high school student, if he's studying, getting ready for a test or something like that, I will say to him, listen, you're better off going to sleep than taking another hour trying to study, because the sleep is going to consolidate your memory. better than an additional hour of studying. Sleep has a huge effect on consolidating our memories, enhancing learning, and naps. The research on naps, I was an anti-nap person until I looked at this research, and the research on naps is pretty powerful as a restorative. The trouble with naps is that we're generally doing them wrong. That super short naps, naps between 10 and 20 minutes, give you enormous bang for the buck. Very little downside. There is a downside to naps, say for an hour and a half. Not only do you have the opportunity cost of the time you spent napping, but when you wake up, you're not ready to roll. There's some what's called sleep inertia that makes that groggy, boggy feeling that you have to dig out of before you can start doing work. But a 10 to 20 minute nap is surprisingly powerful.
Is there a tight coupling between naps and meditation? Is that a similar kind of thing going on in your brain when you're doing these?
That's a great question. My answer is I don't know. I think that but my intuition is that you're spot on. It makes a lot of sense. I have found personally, as a non-napper, that learning how to nap is in some ways, for me at least, was akin to learning how to meditate. That the first time you try to do one of these super short naps, it's very hard because your mind is darting all around, but over time you begin to essentially train your brain to do it. So I don't know the research on this, but I do think there is I share your instincts on that.
Okay, and mention the part about the caffeine. That's kind of the mind-blowing part, the nappuccino.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting. It turns out the best kind of nap that you can do is as follows, is to have a cup of coffee, gulp it, drink it down, and then do your nap. It takes about 25 minutes for the coffee to hit your bloodstream. So if you have that coffee and then do a 20-minute nap, you're going to get the restorative effects of that short nap. But once you wake up, the caffeine is about to hit your bloodstream, and so you get an added boost. So that's my technique these days. I'm not an everyday napper at all, but especially on days when, for whatever reason of travel or stress or circumstance, I feel like I didn't get enough sleep in the evening, I will do a 20 to 25 minute nappuccino.
I think Starbucks just went a collective hooray. And then
maybe Starbucks needs little sleeping pods. They sell a certain kind of coffee for these nappuccinos, and then have these little sleeping bays with 25-minute timers.
Look, I think we can sell this. I think we can sell this. I'll get us some.
Would you fund that?
I don't know if I would. I don't know if I would fund it. That to me sounds like a corporate corporate development endeavor. But nevertheless, I think that would fly. Before I move on, any quick comments that you have on walks in particular?
Walks are valuable for two reasons. One, movement has and again, this is nothing that new. There's been a lot of research lately about the dangers of sitting all day, being sedentary. There is some very, very good research out there on how movement is a mood booster, and even some good research out of Stanford on movement as a creativity booster. The other thing that I mentioned before is that if you're outside, I found, maybe I'm naive, but I found the research on the effects of nature really surprising. Being around nature is surprisingly restorative, at least surprising to someone like me.
Yeah, it's supposedly it's calming. All right, I'm going to move down the last page of the book list, and I'm going to tell you that this next section I didn't understand as well. So this is an educational piece for me. You say that the best way to overcome a bad start is not just to move on, but to start again.
Yeah.
Let's define what a bad start is.
Well, I think it's hard to. I don't think there's a precise definition for a bad start. Let's take it at a personal level. Let's say that you want to. Let's make it really contemporary. So you have New Year's resolutions to go to the gym more, and you start out, and it turns out that your January is busy, and you don't adhere to your gym going activity, and a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, "Okay, this ain't going to happen." One of the things you can do is you can enlist what 3 researchers at the University of Pennsylvania call the fresh start effect. And what that is there's certain dates in the year that operate as temporal landmarks. That is, they stand out from the other kind of forgettable days, and they have a distinct effect on our behavior. They get us to slow down. And most important, here's where I think it gets really interesting, is that they encourage a kind of mental accounting, where, like a business opening up a fresh ledger on a quarter or a new fiscal year, certain dates we sort of open up a fresh ledger on our lives. We relegate our bad selves to the past and say, hey, new me is going to be awesome. So you can, and there are lots of dates that have that kind of effect that gives us a fighting chance to change our behavior. So things like the first of the week, the first of the month, the day after a federal holiday, the day after your birthday. So if you stumble at the beginning, say, and New Year's resolution is a place where a lot of people stumble, you have another chance there are other dates that can make it where you can draw on that kind of effect and make a fresh start.
Right. And so taking advantage of those temporal landmarks, just knowing that they exist, that's a great way to keep propelling you forward.
Yeah. It's not, and again, just to be clear about this, it's not like oh, it's the perfect answer. It's going to work every time. But I'm all about, how do you boost probabilities? How do you boost your chances? How do you give yourself a better shot?
All right. In kind of conjunction with that, in the learning list again, you talked about midpoints.
Yes.
And I think that there's something fundamental about how people behave post midpoints. So why don't we start out talking about the uh-oh effect and its impact on motivation?
Yeah, this is something that comes out of the research of Connie Gersick, who was at UCLA, now is at Yale. And she found something really interesting when she studied teams and doing projects. And when she looked at actually the ground truth of how teams do their work, what she did is she took these teams doing a whole variety of things, coming up with an advertising campaign, coming up with a new offering for a bank, the standard sorts of things that teams do in organizations. And, our notion of how teams operate is that, they start and they move through a steady process until the finish. And she found that was not true at all. That most teams began a project by doing very little, by hemming, hawing, posturing, and getting very little done. But at a certain moment, and this is her phrase, in a sudden burst of activity, they started making changes. They started getting their act together. And what was peculiar about this is that moment was invariably the midpoint in a really eerie way. So if you gave a team 34 days to do a project, they got started in earnest on day 17. If you give a team 11 days to do a project, they get started in earnest on day 6. There's something about hitting that midpoint that triggers, and this is what I like to call the uh-oh effect. People look at it and say, uh-oh, we've squandered half of our time. It's time to get going.
I like the story of the 1982 NCAA men's basketball finals and the value of being just a little bit behind. You want to tell that story?
Sure. This was the 1982, as you say, 1982 NCAA championship game. It featured the UNC Tar Heels, University of North Carolina Tar Heels, led by Coach Dean Smith, who at that point had never won a national championship. They were going up against Georgetown, coached by John Thompson, and led by a fearsome center by the name of Patrick Ewing, who is now today, fast forwarding, the coach of Georgetown. It was at the Superdome in Louisiana, the largest crowd ever to see a game in the Western Hemisphere. And, Ewing was pretty fearsome, hard to defend. And at halftime, Georgetown led by 1 point. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's built on some research by a guy at Jonah Berger at Penn and Devin Pope at University of Chicago, who studied NCAA basketball games and NBA games, in particular, looking at halftime scores. And what they found, and this shouldn't be a shock to anybody, that teams that are ahead at halftime are more likely to win the game. Now, again, that shouldn't surprise us. The team has more points, right? It's pretty, they have a lead already, and there's only half of the game is gone. But there was one exception to that, and that was when teams were down by 1 point at halftime. Teams that are down by 1 point at halftime are actually more likely to win the game. And that's really peculiar. And it goes to what Dean Smith told his team when they were down by 1. He said, we're exactly where we want to be. We're exactly where we want to be. And of course, North Carolina ended up eking out a victory thanks to a shot in the final seconds by a freshman small forward named Michael Jordan. And I think what's interesting about that is that there's experimental research on this as well, that being at the midpoint, being slightly behind is galvanizing. And so if you think about a project team, one of the things to do is to recognize that midpoints exist. The other thing is that sometimes midpoints drag us down. They don't trigger the uh-oh effect. They make us say, oh God, I'm sunk. So recognize midpoints, use them to wake up rather than, give up. But a way to do that is to imagine that you are slightly behind. Being slightly behind at the midpoint is powerfully motivating.
Yeah, I love that notion, because if there's anything about behavioral psychology in the book, it's this, right? I mean, it's the ability to kind of will yourself, motivate yourself with a story like just a little bit behind, just a little bit more, we can do it.
Yep.
Okay, so look, if midpoints are important, then I don't think it's surprising that the power of endings has a place on your list of learnings as well. To me, this feels a little bit like Raging Against the Dying of the Light.
Interesting.
That's
interesting. Yeah.
What are the 4 ways that endings influence our behaviors?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I never thought about it that way. And endings have a big effect in our behavior. And the 4 ways are endings help us energize. So when we see the finish line, we sometimes will kick a little harder. Endings help us encode, and by that I mean they help us evaluate and record experiences. And that's really important in a number of different things. There's a lot of evidence showing that the way an experience, whatever it is, even a life, an experience, whether it's a vacation, whether it is a customer transaction, whether it's, as I said, a life, how that ends has a disproportionate weight on how people remember the totality of it. Endings help us edit. That is, when we get to the end, and not necessarily the end of life, but even like to the end of like a college career or the end of a job tenure, we start editing out the nonsense. We focus on pare down to the essentials. And then finally, endings help us elevate. There's some really powerful evidence showing that people prefer endings that elevate, that have rising sequences to declining sequences. And that's a powerful part of, I think that this preference for endings with rising sequences is really powerful, and there's lots of good stuff we can do with it.
One thing that I picked up that I thought was really informative is the notion that when time is expansive and open-ended, we tend to orient to the future. But when time is constrained and limited, we attune to now. And to me, I think, a little of, part of the 4 ways is this notion of focusing us.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's what allows us to edit. That's why the third thing is that endings help us edit. That is pared down to the essentials, and some very powerful research on that comes from Laura Carstensen at Stanford. What she showed is that if you look at people's friendship networks over time, over their lifetimes, what you see is 20s and 30s and 40s, their friendship network is expanding. 50s, it's really reaching its peak. But post 60, there's a dramatic decline in the size of people's friendship networks. And so superficially, that seems a little bit sad. It's like, oh no, old age is lonely. But in fact, when you unpack that, as Carstensen did, what she did is that she had people divide their friends into the inner circle, the middle circle, and the outer circle. The inner circle, those are the key people in your life. You can't live without them. And then the middle circle and the outer circle. And what she found is that, the total number of friends would decline dramatically. But that's because people were getting rid of the middle and outer and focusing entirely on that inner circle. And Carstensen has a lovely phrase that she talks about. She says the people in the middle and on the outer circles, they were actively eliminated, all right, because people were focused in on what really matters. And that sensing an end of different kinds really spurs what seems to be a search for meaning. And you see this in a number of different other realms as well.
Right. So that kind of maniacal focus on the moral of the story or the finish line or what the value is in why we are and what we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to a slight non sequitur, but it does have to do with endings.
Go for it.
At the end of the chapters, you suggest a bunch of different kind of life hacks about some of the things that we talked about. In the end of this chapter, you talked about when it's time to quit a job. And instead of, I don't want you to just like recite the questions to yourself about how you know when it is, but if I could just get a quick comment on your thinking behind the decision of when it's time to quit a job, because I know pretty much everyone I know always stays in their job too long.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you about that last point. I think there's some techniques we can use to know when it's time to leave. One of the things that's really interesting, and it goes to our earlier discussion about temporal landmarks, is that people are most likely to leave their job on their 1-year anniversary. They use that temporal marker as a decision point. They're also very likely to leave on their 2-year anniversary or their 3-year anniversary. And so one of the things that you can do is you can project yourself out to your next work anniversary and say, do you want to be here then? So let's say I'm coming up my 2-year anniversary on a job, and let's say it's in July. I project myself. I think about, okay, do I want to be, it's July. Do I want to still be at this job? If I say no, you just start looking now. You don't need to wait for that temporal marker to start moving. The other thing about when to quit is less of a, maybe slightly less of a time-based aspect to it, but is really important in the psychology of work, which is this. The ideal jobs are both challenging and in our control. That's the sweet spot. We want it to be challenged, but we want to have some control. And so if you think about this, imagine a job that is challenging and that is not in your control. All right, you're stressed out and freaked out all the time. You're going to burn out. Now imagine a job that is where you're not challenged, but it is in your control. You're bored because it's, you're not challenged about that. And so the ideal jobs are jobs where you have some control and you're challenged. And I think that way of thinking about a job, is it both of these things, gives people a clue about whether it's the right position for them at that moment.
Right. And the other thing about just in general, not that I'm a big fan of quitting in general, but there is, going out on a high level, which is kind of one of the right, is being able to walk out on your own, deciding when it's time, not overstaying your welcome. I think that kind of gets back to, if I could kind of sequitur my non sequitur. Okay. So last thing on your list of learnings is the value of synchronizing as a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. Why don't you talk a little bit about who one should sync to and why? I think there's a couple of them, if I recall right.
Sure. So when we're talking about synchronizing, in this case, what I mean is activities with groups that involve actually coordinating in time. So I write about this group of people men who deliver lunches in Mumbai, India. But you also can think about rowing teams or choirs or whatnot. And it turns out that if you try to unpack what allows groups to synchronize in time, that, as you say, Steve, having a boss, having somebody in charge really matters. There's something that sort of having a single entity that seems to help in synchronization. You see this in choirs where there's a choir master and he or she literally, choir director, he or she literally faces the other direction of the singers. The singers face the audience, but the choir director faces the singers. The singers all look at him or her. This is the one person in the group who doesn't make any sound. And the same thing is true with a coxswain in a crew boat. You have 8 rowers, and then you have somebody who is facing the other direction and who isn't actually rowing, and that's the person in charge. And so there's something about synchronizing with others that seems to require this kind of entity. In some cases, it's simply a clock. Certain deadlines can function like that. But it seems like for groups to coordinate in time, they need that kind of singular boss.
Yeah. Then I think there's the tribe and the heart. Do I have it right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So another way that helps groups synchronize is what I call syncing to the tribe, which is really so interesting that groups synchronize better when they have a sense of belonging. And you see this in that belonging enhances synchronization and synchronization enhances belonging. So you see this in any kind of well-syncing groups often have their own kind of lingo, their own secret codes, sometimes ways of dressing. That this sense of belonging, this very deep-seated need to belong and to affiliate, seems to enhance synchronization And synchronization in turn seems to enhance that. It's really interesting research on that. There's even, again, I happen to be a basketball fan, so I love using basketball examples. But there's an interesting piece of research on NBA teams where they had people who didn't know what they were studying watch videos of some early season NBA games. And all they did was count how often the players touched each other. High fives, low fives, chest bumps, pats on the back. And they found that teams that touched each other were actually more likely to be successful teams. There's something about that sense of being together that is fostered by dress, language, even touch, very, very powerful. And then the final thing is I like to call it singing to the heart, is that, and this is powerful. Let me use choral singing as an example. If you look at the research on choral singing, it's mind-boggling. Choral singing is basically as good for you as physical exercise. It boosts your mood. It is a prophylactic against depression. Amazingly, I mean, at a physiological level, like you take somebody and take their blood at one moment, measure their levels of immunoglobulin, which is the measure of their immune response. Take their levels of immunoglobulin, have them sing in a choir with a group of people, and then take their blood after that group singing. In most cases, they're going to have an improved immune response. They're going to have an elevated pain threshold. It's really incredible. There's something about synchronizing with other people that makes us feel good at both the psychological and the physiological level. And that in turn, and this is fascinating, I think it's fascinating, that in turn enhances our propensity to actually do good. That when people are synchronizing, in the moments after they've synchronized with other people, they're actually more open to outsiders, more likely to collaborate, more likely to do good deeds. I don't feel like I cracked the nut on why this is happening. I still don't know. It's frustrating to me, but there is something about synchronizing with others that is fundamentally human, that is a different kind of mental state than non-synchronous activities.
But I mean, clearly it's a performance boost broadly across a group. And to me,
Totally.
like I said, I think that feels very much like the corporate culture dividend that you get if you have a good corporate culture.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's I think that's a good analogy to that. Yeah.
Before I ask you the bring it all together question, I got to tell people that they need to go back to the portion in your book where you list the coxswain call. I think it was like a just 10-second. It's absolutely hilarious. So
that's a woman named Lydia Barber, who was the coxswain for the George Washington University women's crew team. Lydia is about 4 feet tall. She has dwarfism, and she is this incredibly seasoned coxswain. And I had a tape of her on a call, and I love that. It is awesome.
Yeah, don't spoil it for people. Everyone has to go find it. All right.
Thanks.
So the bring it all together question is, all right. So, as we read the book and it teaches us about personal efficiency, how do we put this all together into the near-term personal efficiency, which we kind of talked about with regard to the times of the day, intermediate personal efficiency in terms of, patterns and putting things together, and then longer term, the arc of our life, right? I know that's a really big question. So, but
no, it's a good question.
Do your best to kind of tie it all together, because I think this book really means a lot about finding the efficient curve and mapping your life to it.
Yeah, great. So it's a great question. It's a challenging question, but you're hinting at what I tried to, I don't know if successfully, but what I tried to accomplish in the book. So in the near term, I think it's fairly straightforward, is to the extent possible, move the right kind of work to the right time of day. So move your analytic work to the peak, which for most of us is the morning. Move your administrative work to the trough. Move your insight tasks, your more creative work to the recovery, which for most of us is later in the day. You might not be able to do that every day, but work the margins. Try to make a little bit of progress on that. You're going to see improvements. No doubt about it. Another thing you can do, which we talked about earlier, Steve, is I'm a huge fan now, and again, I'm eating my own dog food here. I do this myself, of making a break list. Write down each day 2 breaks you're going to take. Even if it's 10 minutes. 10 minutes is fine. 10 or 15 minutes. Write it down, schedule it, and treat it with the same reverence and sanctity with which you treat a scheduled meetings. So I guess that would fall into the short term. in the midterm, I think one of the things that you can do is pay more attention to midpoints. For me, at least, I was blind to midpoints until I started doing the research for this book. But there are midpoints to everything. And the more we're conscious of them, the more we can prevent them from dragging us down and actually take some small steps to help them fire us up. One of the things that's interesting, and again, it's a good segue into the bigger picture, the biggest picture question that you asked, is if you think about something like midlife. The midlife crisis is a total myth. But what research in 70 plus countries shows is that, if you map people's well-being over time, in their 20s and 30s, they're usually pretty high well-being. 40s, it begins to slide. When you get to their early 50s or so, it reaches its bottom point. But it's shaped like a U. And then over time, late 50s, early 60s, 70s, if you're lucky, 80s and 90s, begins to tick back up. And so simply being aware that that is a phenomenon of life, and that if you're like me, someone who's in the early 50s, who's at the bottom right now, that's the bad news. The good news is that the trajectory is going to go back up. But I think that the third point is, I guess there are 2 points on the long term. Number one of them is, as you navigate your life, we focus on who and what and how, and those are important. But you got to bring when into the conversation. It is as a material effect, not only on productivity, but on your overall life well-being. And then second thing is that remember that our lives are not linear. Our lives are more like a series of episodes. And if you treat your life as a series of episodes and are conscious to the temporal aspects of those, if you pay attention to getting a strong beginning, if you understand where midpoints can go awry, if you focus on endings that elevate, endings that give us a search for meaning, and you're aware of these temporal aspects, I think you're going to be happier in your life, because human beings, we live in time, right? We live in time. There's a temporal aspect of our life. And if we're blind to it, we can't take advantage of some of the joys that it can deliver to us.
Well, that's fantastic. So look, you've survived the Inquisition. That was my last. Anything that you want to talk about with regards to timing that I left out? I don't think, but just in case.
No. You just covered a huge amount of territory.
I agree. Okay, so before we end, would you like to tell people how they can follow you, where they should pick up the book, anything else like that?
Sure, you can find the book. It's called When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. You can find it at any bookseller, offline or online. And if you want to find out more information about some of the other stuff I've done or about this book, just go to my website, which is www.danpink.com.
Perfect. That's the end. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thanks. It was fun.
Yeah, the opportunity to talk about this research and what it means for the intangible audience has been fantastic. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glawi, who's been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve BERG.